video. So this is about testing programs to make sure they're suitable. So testing is important, vital that you make sure your tests are appropriate. You need to make sure you have an understanding about the different types of testing. The overall statements on testing, the first type is iterative testing. So testing iteratively is like looping, like always, but testing as you go, as it's being developed. That's the important bit. So we're testing as we write. So we write a couple of lines, we test, we write a couple of lines, we test, blah, blah, blah. That's iterative testing. The next type of testing is final testing or terminal testing. Terminal testing is just we do it all at the end. So we check the actual program at the very end. We do not test as we go necessarily, but we do one big final test. Now most people use a combination of the two. All right, most people do some test bits and bobs as they go and then test the whole thing works as it should at the very end, a more formal final test. There are other types of tests that you need to know about, all right, within the testing sort of remit. The first one is what we call normal testing, which is we test normal values. So we put in it, say if our program asks if a number is less than 5 or is between 0 and 5, we would actually test it with a value that should work. So we'd either type in if our test is testing numbers between 0 and 5, we would put in the number 2, and that would be a normal test. All right, that'd be something within the realms of our program, so a normal test. The next type of test is a boundary test. So a boundary test, you test the upper limits and the lower limits of that test. So in boundary tests, I would type in 0 and I would type in 5, the very edges of my boundary. All right, so whatever the biggest and the smallest numbers are in your range, that's a boundary test. Now, let's get rid of that for you. The last one is called an erroneous test or an invalid test. This is where you're trying to break the program to see what it does. So I would put in a number bigger than 5, so 12, I don't know, and a number smaller than 0, minus 100. Whatever, it doesn't make any difference. They're erroneous. They are supposed to break the test. They are outside, all right, of this range, all right? So they are basically not within our range. That means your program should break, and that's what we're trying to test with an erroneous test, to see what happens if your program breaks. Now, in a test paper, this is how it will look, right? Basically, the first question is a really nice and easy one. State the purpose of a testing plan. Nice, simple. Any of those bullet points down the side, so make sure that it meets the user requirements, make sure it does what's intended, check the program works and doesn't crash, make sure all errors are checked, make sure that the intended result is provided, there's no logical errors, anything like that. That's why we test, right? All of those listed in that mark scheme answer, they're the reasons why we do testing. The next type of question you get, explain the difference between iterative testing and final testing. Remember, iterative is as you go. It's repeatedly testing as you go and making any appropriate changes. Final testing is waiting till the end and then basically do your final, does this program do what I need to test? Like I say, most people do a combination of the two. So having an understanding of both is important. You'll usually test bits as you go and then you'll test the whole thing at the very end. This is an example of the erroneous, normal and boundary um, questions that you might get. So things like this, you've got to look at a different code that could be entered and then the money inserted. The idea is that you'd fill in the box based on the different description of the output. So if there's going to be an error, in other words, it needs to be something outside of the value. And then this one, again, is something outside of the value. So they're testing to see what happens when you break it. That's the idea of these sorts of tests, all right? You might have to check which value it is and then maybe label it. So you'd put that'd be an erroneous test. If the maximum money that could be inserted is £1, it might be a boundary test or whatever it is. So you'd probably be asked to label the type of test or identify data that would fit into that type of test. So if, say, the highest number that the code goes up to is C3 and I put in D7, it should be an erroneous test and therefore fail. That's the point of erroneous testing.